This picture is called Control, not because it means anything or I'm implying anything, but just because this is some sort of control valve, and I'm terrible at naming photos. So don't read anything into the name Control. It's just whatever. It's just a silly name I thought of on the fly, and it probably is pretty bad. There's probably something else you could call this. But I saw this control valve while delivering mail to the campus post office recently, and I thought it might make for a cool photo. I returned a few weeks later and I snapped this one. It wasn't that difficult to get a picture, but it was hard to get a good angle on this. I'm happy with it overall, but I don't really like how the bottom part of the wheel is sort of bisected by that supporting strut. I moved around and I was looking for a good angle to shoot this from, but it wasn't really working out, and it never quite did work out because this finished photo, it still has that arm cutting off the wheel. But that's one of the things about photography. You got to work within the constraints that you have and see what you can do given the limitations of your equipment and your available light and your subject and everything else. So I hope it works. I'm pretty happy with it because it's something new for me. It's not there's nothing organic in this photo. It's all man-made metal and steel and these angled lines, and it evokes a very different feel from like the Mushroom Family photo from a couple of weeks ago, where it's just all earth and earth tones, and you get these mushrooms poking up, and you get this sense of life. None of that happens here, and so it's something a little different for me. And I thought that was just something cool to try out. I shot this at f4 to get a reasonably sharp photo with just a tiny bit of depth of field in the bottom corner to show that there's this sense of perspective because of how things are just a little out of focus in the corner. Maybe I could have gone a little more out of focus, but I like the clean lines throughout this whole thing, and I didn't want to lose that. So f4 seemed to work okay. And the photo here, it's all these straight lines and angles, except for one thing, which is the circular wheel itself, the turning wheel that you use to operate the control valve. That's the only thing that's not angled and straight. And I don't know, I thought that was kind of cool to try. Photographers often use the word juxtaposition, taking two contrasting elements and putting them in the photo. And as far as I'm concerned, that wheel itself is more or less the subject of the photo. And I tried to use other elements to draw the viewer's eyes to that subject. Things like leading lines, where you have lines in your photo that your eye will sort of naturally follow to get to the subject. On the blog itself, I've linked to a Mike Brown video where he discusses leading lines, and Mike Brown is just a photographer who does a lot of YouTube videos. If you want to learn more about photography, just do a Google search for Mike Brown photography and you'll get a ton of videos. But the idea of using these leading lines is something that I don't always do, but I wanted to try and do it here, and I hope it worked. There's certainly a lot better examples of using leading lines than this, but this is just my little take on it. And my inspiration for taking this photo in the first place was architecture photos, particularly photos where the photographer is looking up at a building. Well, where I live, the tallest building within like 50 miles is probably 4 stories. So using a 50mm lens and a crop sensor camera for architecture photos isn't always going to work. But like I mentioned earlier, you got to work within the constraints of what you have. So my solution to doing some sort of architecture photography is to give the viewer a subject to look at, because I don't have a lens. Well, I do, but this lens on this camera, on a crop sensor camera, is not wide enough to take in an entire building, at least not a building around here. So what do you do instead? Well, you take in a very small portion of the building, and in doing so, there's not always something interesting going on. So you have to give the viewer a subject to focus their attention and focus their perception of what's going on here. In this case, there's the wheel, and so I can't fit any of the rest of the boiler room building or the boiler building itself in the photo, but I could fit this one little wheel. And so that was sort of my way of working within the constraints of this 50mm lens, is find a subject, focus on that subject, and then draw my viewer's attention to that subject somehow. The side of a building or a window or something might be interesting, but if you can draw the viewer into one particular subject, then it makes it more compelling. So I don't know if any of this makes sense. If it doesn't, leave a comment on the blog and we'll discuss it further. But my lesson here is look to other photographers for inspiration, but never ever compare yourself. That is such a deadly trap to get into in photography, looking at someone else and saying, well, they're so much better than I am. I'll never be that good. And my camera's not that good. My lens isn't that good. And their photos are better. Never ever do that, because there's no such thing as better or worse. This photography is entirely subjective, and it's all about what works for you. So never look to someone else and say, I'm not as good as that person. No, you're different than that person, and your photos are going to be different than theirs. What you do instead, or what you should do instead, is look to someone else's photos and say, that's a cool idea. I like what that person did. Now I'm going to go try and do something similar or interpret what they did in my own way. So that's, I guess I'll just leave you with that thought here is look to others not for comparison, but for inspiration.